I personally hugely welcome the Met Office report and their network, including in the UN, because it tells us something profoundly detailed. It says there will be an impact, whether you conflate climate change with El Nino or not. But it tells me, as somebody interested in programming humanitarian assistance, it tells me that there is stuff to do.
The El Niño weather event developing in the Pacific Ocean could be the strongest in living memory. That's the warning from the Met Office. Scientists predict it's likely to make 2027 the hottest year on record as its effects combine with human-driven climate change. Hoping to hear from the climate science communicator at the Met Office in just a moment. But let's go first. He's on the line now. We'll speak in a moment to Martin Griffiths, former UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. But let's go first to Graham Madge, who's the climate science communicator at the Met Office. Graham, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Just tell us first what the strongest El Nino in living memory, if that is what happens, what would that mean practically to all of us?
So what we've seen with the forecast for this year is that we're seeing a rise in waters in the tropical Pacific of around 3 degrees or so, even just slightly above 3 degrees. And that is unprecedented in living memory. Normally, we would expect to see a rise of between 1 and 2 degrees. So to see a 3-degree rise suggests that this is going to be an extremely strong event. And that will have ramifications around the world, regional impacts, but also we're likely to see next year, because this will lag into next year, the warmth that's imparted to the atmosphere, we're likely to see next year being one of the, if not the warmest years on record.
Yeah, just explain how warmer oceans impact on, warmer temperatures in the air. How does that work?
So the heat that's building in the eastern tropical Pacific imparts around a zero point 0.2, perhaps even stronger in this case, rise in global average temperature. And that is enough with rising temperatures caused by greenhouse gas emissions to actually trigger these particularly strong El Nino years, normally as record years, as we saw in 2015, for example.
And I read that the El Nino might mean suppressed hurricane activity, for example, in the Atlantic Ocean. So are there some effects of a stronger El Nino that are positive?
We have to remember that this is natural variation. This isn't anything to do with climate change. We've had El Ninos for an extremely long time. The impact that we see with tropical cyclones is effectively we get more wind shear, and that effectively blows hurricanes apart. So yes, you're quite right, there will be some implications that may be beneficial. So in the Caribbean and the Atlantic basin, we may well see fewer hurricanes, which will obviously be welcome to people in those regions. But conversely, we will also see quite significant impacts potentially in regions like Southeast Asia, where we're likely to see much drier conditions. That can lead to problems with agriculture. It can lead to increased risk of wildfire, a region already prone to wildfire. We're likely to see drought and issues with rainfall in India, and also we're likely to see parts of sub-Saharan Africa see less rainfall. So overall, when you put these together globally, there are likely to be very significant impacts.
And so, the negative effects vastly outweighing the positives.
Yes, because we're talking about the production of food, for example. So that's going to be a very real risk when we get to crop season, when these crops are harvested, and if there's regions in drought that have been affected by El Nino. As I say, El Nino is an entirely natural climate phenomenon, pattern of variability in the climate. But what we're seeing is the impacts of El Nino actually adding to what's happening with climate change. And therefore, the two are working in tandem to produce even more extreme results in some cases.
And obviously, you've talked about the impact that warmer oceans have on air temperatures, but the marine life severely affected. Just talk for a minute about the effect on fish species, and also we've seen in the Mediterranean, for example, this year, unwelcome jellyfish invasions, for example, because of those warmer sea temperatures.
So yes, so there will be a temporary pattern of increased temperatures in the tropical Pacific, and then the systems generally go down and back to neutral conditions, and then indeed we can see the opposite, La Niña, where you get slightly cooler waters in the eastern tropical Pacific. But it's true to say, Kathy, that we've been living with a marine heat wave around the coastal waters of the UK for most of this year. I was on a ship a couple of weeks ago, and the ocean temperature was 21 degrees off the coast of North Devon. Normally it would be about 16. So we're seeing temperature anomalies of 4 or 5 degrees even around the UK, and that will, of course, have impacts on our own weather.
Well, you've set out the scale of the impacts and how devastating that could be for humanity. So what's the best way of people preparing, governments and citizens preparing for what's ahead?
Well, what we're saying today, with our warning from our lead scientist on this topic, that this is the most significant in lifetime, is that we do need to be prepared for impacts. We recognise that this event has been well forecast. The significance of the event has now been highlighted, and we need globally to prepare for the shocks that will ensue from such a significant event.
Well, thanks very much for setting that out so clearly, Graham. Let's turn now to Martin Griffiths, who's former UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and on the line now. Good evening, Martin.
Hello, Kathy. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. You heard there from Graham, the need for people to prepare, for governments to prepare. Do you have any sense that there is a readiness in governments around the world to deal with this?
Well, I think what's really important, and Graham set it out, and you have been pressing for it, is, and it's from my experience too, is that we have an objective, scientifically based, careful assessment of what's going to happen. And in this world that we live in, and we have been living in together for so long, the world of war, the world of humanitarian assistance, where I come from, we haven't had that. We've had interests, we've had biases, we have a lack of objective information. And I personally hugely welcome the Met Office report and their network, including in the UN, because it tells us something profoundly detailed. It says there will be an impact, whether you conflate climate change with El Nino or not, but it tells me, as somebody interested in programming humanitarian assistance, it tells me that there is stuff to do and we can rely on it. And we can't rely on a lot of political reports and assessments and pressure to see something as clearly as they are telling us.
I'll come back to the politics of all this in just a second.
Right.
But just want to ask you about the impact of, if this forecast is borne out of that the Met Office has set out. Your work in humanitarian affairs, it seems to me from what Graham was saying that a lot of the worst impact of this will be felt in poorer countries in the developing world. Is that your assessment?
Yes, it is. And I think we're already seeing it. And what's not exciting, that's obviously the wrong word, but when I was running the humanitarian operations around the world, I tried hard, slightly in vain, to use climate science and climate assessments as our basis for programming priorities. So would you send aid first to this district or that district and so forth, where we had a professional assessment, unchallenged, objective assessment. This, I didn't succeed, by the way. This will succeed, partly because we've all gone through a hellish summer. The English people, as you know, Kathy, are now transforming their natural discussion about British weather to actually British weather.
And the severity of that, houses burned down by wildfires.
Yeah, and it's real, isn't it? I mean, nobody has any delusions anymore about these issues. And I live in Geneva, and it's the same here. So we have a reference which will take us to serious decisions about program priorities in the humanitarian, probably also development. And I think they're already happening. I think humanitarian agencies are very careful about not being taken on by political
vested interest.
Yeah, but they are very clear about the value of this.
But you say no one has any delusions, but when you look at preparedness, whether it's here in the UK about the number of firefighters we've got, or the equipment to tackle the blazes we saw this summer, and when you look in the Mediterranean, what's happened there with wildfires, there's extraordinary wildfires in France and Spain, for example. There doesn't really seem to be a sense that we're prepared for what the effects of this warming climate and now this El Niño phenomenon.
No, and I was, by absolute chance, 25 years ago, the UN focal point for El Niño with humanitarian operations. We spent no time on it at all. And it is still true in our preparedness today, as you've just said, Kathy. To spend money on preparedness is money you can't spend on response. Obviously, there's a limited amount of money, much less now because of the funding cuts. So we need to have a compelling argument and compelling successes, obviously, in this kind of assistance, to say this is money well spent. And what I think the Met Office and its network has done has given us the basis for coming to that conclusion. It's not there yet. Government, preparedness funding is always appallingly slow. Same with the UN, same with other governments. But we do actually have a reference here, which is undeniable.
For years, there was all the talk, through successive COPs, for example, conferences, just about averting the worst of climate change and, keeping the 1.5 degrees of warming, keeping that goal alive, etc. Was there too slow a shift to adapting to climate change rather than trying to head it off, and it now feels that tipping point has been reached?
I do think so. And I was in the various COPs in my UN period as well. And I think we weren't convinced by the political argument. It was an important political argument. There were very good progresses from Glasgow onwards. But what in the humanitarian business, which is a huge enterprise, huge amounts of money going in and out of providing aid to those who suffer, you need to have a sense of what's going to work. And the advocacy was more about what isn't working and what we need to protect, rather than how we can actually make it work. I think the Met Office report begins to give us a basis for saying, don't go to that district, go to that district, do more over there, and make a difference. And humanitarian agencies, like any other, are very, very interested in making a difference.
But nevertheless, it's the politicians that have to, prepare in government around the world. And, a lot of people might feel quite hopeless about the lack of political leadership that's been observed around the world on this issue of climate change for so many years. What would you say to that feeling of people thinking, well, they're watching what's happening, the world burning around them? What would you say to them about that feeling that political leaders just aren't up to the job?
Time up. I mean, we've all been through a hellish summer. We were getting a worse one, according to the Met Office, next year. It's no longer a question that we're in deep trouble. It's not about advocacy. It's not about forecasts. It's about the reality that we all face. And that means that, you were talking about Andy Burnham earlier in the program. That means that our leaders, including the UN, where I come from, need to say money is needed to address this.
Yeah, money's in short supply, though, isn't it?
Money is in very short supply. But this is a way, I would argue, Kathy, of saying smart programming is not in short supply. Smart programming based on objective science, and I pushed it when I was in the UN, is not in short supply. We will have failures, we will have awful things happening, but we will be trying to be smart about the way that nature is doing things to our people.
Where are you seeing the smartest thinking on this? Where are you seeing the leadership that you crave?
I think there's a lot of, and speaking of my past experience, there's a lot of incredibly important, as you know, agencies, civil society organizations, the Earth people, and so forth, who are saying this so clearly, with lots of statistics, lots of facts, The key thing that's not working in my community is whether that translates into leadership to make this the first of many priorities for the way we spend our assistance. Limited as it is, but it's there.
Well, Rosalind Schofield has been listening to this and messages in and says the Climate Change Committee, a non-political body, just like the Met Office, as you've been talking about, has been providing evidence-based risk assessments for a number of years to government about the need to adapt to what is happening meteorologically. And this has been ignored for at least 15 years. What would be your response to Rosalind there?
Well, I agree. I mean, I was part of that. I mean, I tried to make climate science and climate data a part of programming priorities, and it was very difficult to do it. What's happening now, I think Rosalind would agree, is much more extreme. Firstly, we all have lived through this period now. None of us are denying climate change anymore, and El Niño is going to be even worse. The question is how we translate that into action. And I think there's a much greater chance of that now than in the last 15 years.
Why? Just tell me why.
Well, because it's unobjectionable. It's evident. We know it. We live our streets on it. And we know that it's not a fantasy and it's not a scientific deal that we avoided. And I think what will happen, humanitarian agencies, in my experience, are extremely practical. They have limited funds and they spend them wisely.
And there's also self-interest here, isn't there? That, when you look at the number of people coming on small boats to the UK, for example, climate change is just going to exacerbate that exodus of people from the hardest hit countries. So there is a self-interest in British taxpayers tackling this problem, isn't it?
Probably. It's not my subject, Kathy, actually.
Okay, well,
but there are reasons around the world, aren't there?
Yeah.
To connect on this, as you're saying.
Well, small glimmers of hope there in some of what you're saying, and quite a sort of desperate subject.
I think there's large glimmers of hope. I mean, I think if we don't go into 27 with more money for this kind of programming and this kind of dealing with the subject, preventing suffering as a result of it, then let's come back and talk together.
Martin Griffiths, thank you very much for joining us with that clear-eyed assessment, and Graham Madge earlier from the Met Office.